OROMIA11.
Hello and welcome to One Talk Show. This is our weekly program broadcast on OROMIA11 from Twin Cities of Minneapolis, Minnesota. Today we have a special guest who is a veteran U.S. diplomat who served as U.S. ambassador to Ethiopia from 1996 to 1999. And his name is Ambassador David SHINN. He's well versed on situation in Ethiopia and Africa-China relations, and he has published numerous articles on topics on Ethiopia, on Africa-China relations. Today we will have a conversation on current situation in Ethiopia. Welcome to One Talk Show, Ambassador David SHINN.
Thank you, Matthias.
Thank you for accepting our invitation to have conversation with us. And to start our conversation on current situation on Ethiopia, what is your assessment, observation on current situation in Ethiopia?
In my view, the situation continues to worsen in the country and become of greater concern, not only for Ethiopians, but for outsiders too, and indeed for the entire Horn of Africa. The conflict that began in Tigray region has now clearly expanded into Amhara and Afar regions. It appears as though even the city of Addis Ababa could conceivably be under some threat, although that may well be exaggerated. And it's not clear that the Tigrayan forces and the Oromo Liberation Army have the intention of trying to go into Addis Ababa, but it certainly raises questions. The human rights situation is bad still. It's been bad from the beginning, and it continues to be extremely worrisome. The humanitarian assistance issue is not getting any better, certainly not any better in Tigray, and probably not any better in much of Amhara region. So all of the elements that were what I would call negative to begin with remain negative, if not worse.
Thank you. An article, even you posted that article yesterday. An article was published on Foreign Policy magazine yesterday, says, quote, "A war of all against all. Both sides have decided to double down in pursuing war in the name of ending it. This will likely bring about an irreversible state collapse, which would also have regional consequences." I took this statement from that Foreign Policy magazine, which was published yesterday. A war of all against all. Do you agree with this assessment?
Yeah, of course, that was not, as you point out, not my article. It was one that I posted on my blog, and I try to post material which I think is well written and provides a credible argument from different points of view. I don't always agree with everything that I post that is written by others. In this case, I do worry that the current internal situation in Ethiopia has the possibility, the very considerable possibility of impacting countries outside of Ethiopia. To some extent, it already has, and that you have refugees, Ethiopian refugees in Sudan. You have Eritrean troops inside Ethiopia, and you have seen Ethiopian peacekeepers recalled from Somalia in order to presumably reinforce their ranks in Ethiopia. So those have already happened, but the continuing breakdown of law and order in Ethiopia will inevitably have an impact on neighboring countries, if for no other reason, in the form eventually of refugees going to other countries. And that would be most unfortunate. Ethiopia has a history of being a refuge for refugees, not so much being an exporter of refugees. So it would sort of turn Ethiopia's role on its head if that were to happen. I do worry that the situation could become more regional. And I also worry that for the first time ever, that this could possibly result in the balkanization of Ethiopia, literally the carving up of the country. And in my view, that would be a mistake. I would like to see Ethiopia maintain its unity. Whatever political system the Ethiopians choose is their business, but I would hate to see the country break apart.
Great, thank you. Regarding Ethiopian relation with the U.S., there are two assumptions. The pro-government people believe that the government of Ethiopia wants its sovereignty to be respected, and on the other hand, United States wants Ethiopian government to stop killing its own people. These are two assumptions and two different views. How do we reconcile this? So the pro-government thinks that America is breaching the sovereign integrity of the country, while the American government wants the Ethiopian government to stop killing its own people.
Well, I think the United States' position on this has been crystal clear from day one. It has constantly supported the unity of Ethiopia. There has been no variation in that. So if there are members or parties in Ethiopia or part of the government of Ethiopia who believe otherwise, they're just simply mistaken. They simply don't understand U.S. policy. And I think it's unfortunate if there are those who have the view that the United States is somehow supporting the division of the country in some manner. They're not, and there's never been any official statement to that effect from the U.S. government. So I don't know where that's coming from, quite frankly. I'm sorry, there was another part, I think, to your question that I didn't deal with. What was the other?
So the U.S. government wants the Ethiopian government to stop killing its own people. That's.
Yeah, and that too has been a position of the U.S. government from the very beginning, and that's to end the humanitarian crisis, to be sure that those parts of Ethiopia, whether they're in Tigray or Amhara region, are able to receive emergency assistance and food and medical supplies, that hospitals are open, that persons who are injured or suffering from shortages of food can be taken care of in any part of Ethiopia where they're being negatively impacted, and that certainly the killing end. And the only way to end the killing is, at least initially, to have a ceasefire. And both sides have to agree to that, obviously. This is not something that only one side can do. But a ceasefire is absolutely critical to get the killing stopped. And then hopefully after that, the beginning of negotiations. And that, too, has been a consistent part of U.S. policy.
Thank you. Jeffrey Feltman, the special envoy of the U.S. President to the Horn of Africa, is currently shuttling between Nairobi and Addis to negotiate a ceasefire or bringing both parties together. And do you think he can bring opposing parties together What would you think is the prospect?
I think we've got to be very honest about this. I think the short answer to the question is no. He himself, he alone cannot bring the two parties together. But it's important to understand that the key interlocutors in this effort to bring peace to Ethiopia are the former President Obasanjo of Nigeria, representing the African Union, also the Secretary General of the United Nations. These are really the key players. The United States, I think, is playing a supporting role. It backs up what Obasanjo and the Secretary General are trying to do, using whatever tools the United States has at its disposal. But I don't think there's any belief at all that Jeffrey Feltman, the U.S. Special Envoy, can single-handedly bring this matter to a closure, and particularly a peaceful closure. But he and the United States can play an important role in helping others to do that, including our European allies. And occasionally, you even see Russia and China joining on when they supported this past week a ceasefire at the United Nations in Ethiopia. All 15 members of the UN Security Council voted in favor of a ceasefire, including China and Russia.
So, what would be the prospect to stop the bloodshed then, if the U.S. is only playing a supporting role?
The United States can offer ideas and suggestions. It can try to meet with the various sides or factions in the dispute in an effort to bring them a little closer to the other side so that there's some compromise involved. The United States has already imposed some very limited sanctions in Ethiopia and has the prospect for imposing more sanctions. There are those who argue that sanctions will only worsen the situation, and there are others who argue that it's one of the few tools that exists to try to get the parties to the negotiating table. The United States takes the position that it's one of the tools to get the parties to negotiate. Countries like China and Russia argue that all sanctions are bad and they want nothing to do with them. That's a different point of view. But those are essentially the tools that the U.S. has, and I would acknowledge they're quite limited.
Thank you. As you might heard, there are 9 opposition groups came together in Washington, D.C. last week and signed a memorandum to work together to topple down the government or to bring the put pressure on the government to sit down and negotiate. They did sign agreement last week in Washington, D.C. What is your take on that?
Well, my first reaction was any effort like this that happens in Washington rather than in Ethiopia is not going to have much effect. And I acknowledge that there are at least 2 organizations that signed on to that agreement, the TPLF and the Oromo Liberation Army, that are significant and one must take account of. The other 7 organizations, for the most part, are little known and may or may not have any members under arms in Ethiopia. Several of them I'm not even familiar with, and I don't know whether they have much support in Ethiopia. But the point is that I don't pay a great deal of attention to an initiative that originates so far away from Ethiopia, and when some of the organizations involved are not well known.
But these organizations, they have leadership back home. if we take TPLF or Oromo Liberation Army, their commanders, their leadership are back home, and there are other two or three, the Benishangul People's Liberation Movement and the Gambela People's Liberation Army. They have operations back in the western Ethiopia, in the southwestern Ethiopia, as far as I know. These are their representatives who resides abroad, those who signed the agreement, but it's by the order of their leaders back home.
No, I understand that, and that's all well and good. And I realize, I acknowledge that the TPLF and the OLA are significant organizations. And the others, there are a couple of the others that do have some armed support in Ethiopia. But my basic point is that if you really want to have an impact, then you need to do that kind of thing in Ethiopia, which admittedly is much harder to do. But that's where the action is. That's where the activity is. It's not in Washington.
Yeah, great. Let me take you to some other topic, like the continuous behavior of the Ethiopian regime, or the Ethiopian government, rather, I prefer as a regime. And again, is lying, fake news, and blaming CNN, BBC, Reuters, Agence France Presse, Associated Press, main Western media outlets as biased. And this is a challenge to build a democratic society. And what is your take on that? How do we even reconcile if they mistrust all the major media outlets and foreign government diplomats and other entities?
Well, it's human nature for individuals of whatever nationality to discard whatever reporting is that they don't like or that they disagree with. It's very easy to say, well, it's fake news or it's misinformation or it's wrong. Anyone can do that. What is important is to try to get the best available information, and I think a great deal of what has been reported by Reuters and Agence France Presse and Deutsche Welle, the New York Times, the Washington Post, Associated Press, and I could go on and on, I think has been quite good. Now, do they make mistakes from time to time? Of course they do. And it's very easy to pick and choose a few mistakes that one can identify after the fact and then dismiss everything that they report. I think that's unfortunate. One simply has to take the best information that is out there and rely upon it for one source of news. And if you know the situation fairly well in the region, you get a pretty good idea who is getting it right and who is getting it wrong. So as a result, I don't pay much attention to what I hear coming from either the TPLF side or from the government of Ethiopia side. They have their own positions, their own agenda. They're not necessarily trying to report the facts. They're trying to report whatever supports their side of the argument. So I'm more interested in what I hear from non-governmental organizations, from UN agencies, from members of the press who are on the ground, particularly on the ground in Tigray and Amhara regions where the action is. Those are the kinds of groups that I pay the most attention to.
Thank you. Let us talk about human rights. After we schedule this conversation, Amnesty International just released a report today that abuses occurred in the Amhara region, where areas under the control of TPLF before and then after they retreat. And also last week, United Nations High Commission for Human Rights and Ethiopian Human Rights Commission have released a joint report. And how do we assess, how do we accept these reports while there is no independent investigation going on the ground?
Well, time will help us sort some of this out. I think when you have the early reports, and the one concerning TPLF atrocities in Amhara is still a very early report, it is important to try to get additional information to confirm what has happened there. I think it's very apparent, based on early reporting from Tigray region, that there were horrible atrocities in Tigray region that were aimed at Tigrayan ethnic group. And those are fairly well documented, although I'm sure that some of that has mistakes in it also, and that more information is ultimately needed to verify some of those reports. We now are getting reports of these atrocities in Amhara region by the TPLF and through Amnesty International, and these have got to be looked at very carefully and verified. And if they are verified, the TPLF has to be held to account. It's just that simple. And it looks at first glance like some bad things happen. And this is the tragedy of what is going on in Ethiopia today. There are so many innocent people on various sides of the conflict that are being caught up in this. And they have nothing to do with the conflict, but they're the victims of it. And this is why it's important to have a ceasefire and to get negotiations underway.
Thank you. What would your best scenario to carry forward building democratic society in Ethiopia?
Well, the idea of building democracy in Ethiopia today is almost an oxymoron. It's almost impossible at the moment to build any democracy in the country today. I mean, you had elections, yes, in much of Ethiopia, and that's the right approach to building democracy. But until you can end this civil war, the idea of building democracy is simply not going to happen. You can't have democracy with an ongoing war. And first item on the agenda is stopping the war, and then getting back to the basics of building a democracy, which means everything from a free, or at least a relatively free and open press, which has been interrupted by the war, rule of law taking place, not a state of emergency, but the rule of law reinstated with an independent judicial system that can take account of these various allegations of atrocities that have been going on in the country. I mean, there are so many elements to building democracy, but none of it's going to happen until the war comes to an end.
Thank you. Do you think there is imminent state collapse in Ethiopia?
No, I don't see imminent state collapse. Ethiopia has been around for a couple thousand years, and it has gone through some very difficult historical periods, and yet it's survived. And I'm still hopeful that history will serve Ethiopia well, and that it can survive this too. But having said that, for the first time in my study of Ethiopia, which goes back to the early 1960s, I am worried that the current situation there could result in the breakup of the country. I've never thought that before. I never thought it was really even a possibility. Now I would acknowledge that it is, I believe, a possibility. I'm not saying it will happen, and I don't believe it will happen imminently, but it could happen in the coming months or years, and that is very worrisome.
Thank you. This is personal question. Are you writing any policy recommendation to Foreign Policy Council or to the U.S. government currently?
No, I have not been asked to write any, and I have not volunteered any. I make comments to the media. I'm constantly talking with organizations like Al Jazeera or BBC or some other organizations and express my views there, which may or may not be given any credence by the administration. I have no way of knowing, but I have not written any policy recommendations or policy documents for the U.S. government concerning Ethiopia.
That's great, thank you. But this is another personal question. Are you in touch with Ethiopia? Do you enjoy any ethnic food around the DC area?
I'm sorry. Do I have any?
Do you go to Ethiopian restaurants and enjoy the dorowat or any other ethnic food?
Well, I used to do that with great regularity. Unfortunately, COVID-19 put a halt to most of that. Now there are Ethiopian restaurants in my neighborhood, and I would try to get there every other month or so. I haven't been in some time, quite frankly, but I haven't been to very many other restaurants either. It's a result of COVID, not politics.
Thank you. So, as a wise man, through experience, through diplomacy, through academic research, what message do you have for Ethiopians, Oromos, Tigrayans, or all over Ethiopia who have, pick a side and fighting each other for autonomy, for power, or to preserve the status quo, or to change the status quo?
Well, if I were talking particularly to the average Ethiopian, whether in the diaspora or in Ethiopia for that matter, I would strongly urge that they end immediately this business of hate speech on social media. I think that is poisonous. It's unhelpful. It serves no useful purpose whatsoever. In fact, it serves a negative purpose. And it's one of the worst things I've seen in recent years concerning my interaction with Ethiopia and Ethiopians. I just find it horribly disappointing to see that. And there's been far too much of it. If I were talking with Ethiopian officials or with the TPLF or with the OLA, with anyone involved in the conflict, I would urge a much greater willingness to engage in compromise. This is really tough for Ethiopians. They're terrible at compromise and always have been. But one thing that I think is a strength of Western society is we're a little better at compromising on controversial issues. And my experience with Ethiopians, and particularly Ethiopian officials or elites or leaders, is that they really don't much appreciate compromise. It's either my way or the highway. And if you don't like my way, then just leave. I'm not willing to talk with you. And that just doesn't work very well in a situation like this. There has to be a willingness to alter, to some extent, strongly held positions on issues. And I haven't seen much of that in the context of this conflict. And I really would like to see more of that.
Thank you. If you get a chance, by chance, get a chance to meet with the Prime Minister of Ethiopia, with Abiy Ahmed, what would your advice to him would be?
Well, one, I don't expect to have that opportunity. And not only that, but I'm not traveling to Ethiopia anytime soon. Primarily, again, because of the COVID problem. But if I were to offer any advice, one, it would be what I just referred to. more openness to compromising on controversial issues with the other side. And I would make the same argument to the TPLF and the OLA and anyone else who would listen. And two, I think I would say something about how do you see the long-term future of the country? I know that the Prime Minister has come out with his Medemar and it's sort of his philosophy on looking forward and all of that. And I've skimmed through the English translation of it. I'm not totally sure how that gets to an end point, however, for where Ethiopia needs to be 10, 20, 50 years from now. And I think it's time that the leadership of the country give really serious thought to where do we want to be 20 or 50 years from now, and how do we get there peacefully? And I would just urge that the leadership or that the Prime Minister focus on that question. It's a big question. It's a big issue. And I really wonder whether leadership has thought much about that.
Great. Thank you very much. And if you have any final word, so we will conclude our conversation.
Well, my only final word is I really wish that this conflict could be brought to a quick end so that the average Ethiopian can get back to a normal life, and the death and destruction and hardship can be brought to an end. That's all I wish for the Ethiopian people.
Thank you. Are you still teaching?
I am. I'm teaching 2 courses this semester.
Oh, okay, great. Ambassador David SHINN, previous ambassador to Ethiopia from 1996 to 1999. Thank you for your time with us.
Thank you.
With this, we come to the conclusion of our conversation with Ambassador David SHINN. Thank you for watching. See you next time.
Maqaan kiyya Aishaa Aliiti. Ani ogummaan kiyya nersiidha yookaan waa'ee fayyaa keessaan hojjedha. Ramsey County keessatti waldaa hawaasa Oromootirraa nin hirmaadha. Guyyaa tokko daa'ima argachuuf karoora ni qabda yoo ta'e talaallii COVID-19 fudhachuun hagam fayyaa kiyya miidha jettee yaaduun malta. Oduun gaariin jirtu ragaan talaalliin COVID-19 rakkoo ulfarratti fidu yookiin ulfa miidhu mul'isu tokkolleen hin jiru. Dhugumatti rakkoon dhala dhabuu miidhaa rakkoo talaallii kamirraahuu fudhachuun wal qabatuu miti. Hojiin talaallii qaamni kee vaayirasii COVID-19 akkamitti akka ifirraa ittisu barsiisuudha. Yeroo qaamni kee akkaataa miidhaan irra gahuu maluu danda'u firraa ittiin ittisu baratee ofiinuu talaallichi ni dhabamsiisa. Talaalliin kun waa tokkolleen isaa qaama kee keessatti hin hafu. Yaaddawuun waa'ee talaallii fi hormaataa yookaan dahumsa qabaachuun humaa rakkoo hin qabu. Hormaanni fayyaa keenya keessatti hedduu fardiidha. Waa'ee talaallii COVID-19 fi ulfaa laalchisee odeeffannoo dabalataa argachuuf ogeessa yookaan doktora kee waliin haasawi. Galatoomaa.
OROMIA11 Ani fuya damae, badia fi magalawa, kadie sodu waltawa. Oromia 11.